Once food reaches the stomach, we're going to have a whole lot more chemical digestion occurring and a whole lot more mechanical digestion occurring. So the stomach serves a number of different roles for us in terms of digestion, and obviously a big one is that it does a lot of churning. Okay, it churns the food around, it squeezes it in lots of different directions, and that results in sufficient a whole lot of, in other words, mechanical breakdown. And again, remember, we're trying to increase surface area compared to the volume of the food, because the greater the surface area compared to volume, the more rapidly my enzymes can digest that food. So this mechanical breakdown process is assisted in the stomach by the fact that in that muscularis mucosa layer, that muscularis externa layer, the one that has the outer longitudinal layer and the inner circular layer, in between those two layers is a third layer of smooth muscle tissue that runs at sort of an oblique, kind of like almost like a 45-degree angle. And because I have 3 layers of muscle tissue here as opposed to the standard 2, I have, and because that third muscle layer is oriented at kind of a 45-degree angle to the other 2, I have the ability to squeeze the food in all 3 axes, in all 3 planes, and that helps a lot with digesting that food and creating this kind of mechanical force necessary for breaking down the surface area to volume ratio. And as we get more and more churning occurring, we produce a fluid-like substance of undigested materials and partially digested materials called chyme. So chyme is basically mostly undigested food, although there's a little bit of food that is already been digested in that liquefied portion, and that includes some of those starches that we had in the mouth that were digested by salivary amylase before it came in contact with the acidic environment of the stomach. And it's also going to include about 10% of the lipids we've digested that are now getting chemically broken down by lingual lipase, because lingual lipase is activated by the acidic environment of the stomach. Other things that the stomach does, it has the ability to absorb alcohol in our food. So some of the alcohol we consume, not all of it, but some of it does get absorbed in the stomach. The rest gets absorbed in the small intestine. But other than the little bit of digestion from lingual lipase and a little bit of digestion of proteins via a enzyme called pepsin that I'll talk about in a little bit, there's no other kinds of chemical digestion going on. Everything is mostly mechanical with the exception of the pepsin and the lingual lipase. Those are the only 2 that really get involved in any sort of chemical digestion. So once we've had several hours, say 3 to 6 hours of churning in the stomach, a consistent chyme is produced. We've mixed the fluids up considerably. We've created a lot of small particles with a lot of surface area compared to their volume. And then at that point, what the stomach does is it begins to slowly dump measured quantities of this chyme into the small intestine. And it only does so as the small intestine tells it to. So the small intestine actually sends signals to the stomach telling it, okay, hey, I'm ready for some more chyme, send me some more. And the stomach will release a little more chyme and then wait until the small intestine signals again for a new batch of chyme. So we dribble in a little chyme at a time into the small intestine, and this helps to promote the efficiency of digestion that we'll see happening in the small intestine. There are lots of different anatomical features to the stomach. I'm only briefly going to cover them here because you'll go over them in more detail in lab, no doubt. You have a what's called the greater curvature. That's the outer portion of the stomach here. You have a lesser curvature here on the inside that I'm outlining in red here. There is obviously the muscularis externa that we already talked about, and it's special because it has those 3 layers, the circular, the oblique, and the longitudinal layers of muscle tissue. There are 4 sort of regions, if you will, to the stomach, and these include the fundus. That's this portion that's kind of above where the esophagus comes in. Here's where the esophagus comes in. So here's the fundus above that location. Then there's the body, more or less, of the stomach. And then there's the cardiac region. And the cardiac region is kind of this little area right in here where we intersect with the esophagus. And then lower down towards where the stomach connects up with the small intestine is the final portion. This is called the pyloric region. And immediately adjacent to the pyloric region is a circular sphincter of smooth connective tissue called the pyloric sphincter, and that's what relaxes to open and allow chyme to flow into the small intestine a little bit at a time. Also found in the stomach are a number of different gastric glands. These are glands that are situated in the actual lining or wall of the stomach. There are glands that are found in the cardiac region. They're called cardiac glands. And the types of cells that make up the cardiac gland are a little different from the kind of cells that make up the glands found in the pyloric region, which are called the pyloric glands. And then there are the gastric glands, which are found more like in the body of the stomach. And each have a different, slightly different composition of cells. We're not going to worry about that. You may need to know that for lab, though. Last thing is the stomach. The internal lining of the stomach is very wrinkly. It has a wrinkled appearance to it. That wrinkled appearance, those wrinkles are called rugae. Okay, that's plural. Ruga is singular, rugae is plural. And those are little folds in the stomach that allow for the stomach to stretch considerably when food enters into the stomach. And then, of course, to be able to return back to its smaller size at a later point in time. On a microscopic level, I'm going to take you through an example of just one of these glands and show you the different kinds of cells that are found, for example, in a gastric gland. So if we look here, just to orient you, here would be the lumen of the stomach. And then we've got some mucus, okay, situated kind of in that purpley area. And then, of course, you've got all these epithelial cells that are lining the stomach. And notice how they dip downward through the mucosal and into the submucosal layer. And there are a number of different types of cells found here. I'm going to go over them briefly. There are what are called chief cells. And in this picture, they represented chief cells as these guys here, kind of purplish colored guys. And the chief cells are responsible for manufacturing the inactive version of an enzyme. The inactive version they secrete is called pepsinogen. And when pepsinogen becomes active, it forms pepsin. And it's the presence of hydrochloric acid that actually causes pepsinogen to get cut into smaller pieces and into its active pepsin form. In a little bit, well, actually in the last lecture in this series on the digestive system, when we look at the chemical processes of digestion, we'll come back and see exactly what it is pepsin does to help digest proteins. But for now, you can just know it's digesting proteins and leave it at that. Another type of cell that's often found in these gastric pits are parietal cells. Parietal cells are represented in this drawing by this picture right here, and they are very good at manufacturing hydrochloric acid. We're going to learn how they do that on the next slide. They also manufacture another molecule called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is an absolutely required molecule. You have to have it in order to absorb B12. If you don't make intrinsic factor or you don't make enough intrinsic factor, you will not be able to absorb substantial amounts of B12 in your food, from your food, and you will develop pernicious anemia. And you learned about that when we talked about the blood. Another type of cell are the mucosal cells. There's lots of these. Their job is simply, as the name implies, to manufacture mucus. And here, these are examples of mucosal cells. You can see that they line a substantial part of both the stomach itself and this pit where the glands are located. The pit part, by the way, is this upper region here. It doesn't actually become a gland until we get down into this region where we have things like the chief cells and the parietal cells that are actually secreting something other than mucus. The importance of mucus cannot be overstated. Your stomach is a highly acidic environment, and it would be very damaging to your own body cells in the stomach if you didn't have some way to protect those cells lining the stomach from the action of hydrochloric acid. And the way we protect them against the hydrochloric acid is by coating everything with this mucus layer that serves as sort of a barrier. There are also found down in these gastric pits things called regenerative cells. And they don't really show a picture of these, but these are kind of like they're a type of stem cell, and their job is, when needed, to generate new chief cells or to generate new parietal cells, to make new mucus cells, to make new enteroendocrine cells that I'm going to talk about in a second. So they're just kind of the reserve. They allow for manufacture of whatever cell is needed to replace ones that have died or been damaged. Last of the types of the cells is the enteroendocrine cell. These are cells that have the ability to manufacture paracrines and hormones. And I'll give you an example just of one. Gastrin is a hormone we're going to learn about later that is important in digestion in the stomach. And the enteroendocrine cells are the ones that manufacture this. They also manufacture things like histamines and others, which we'll learn about later. So, as promised, I told you we'd learn how it is that hydrochloric acid is manufactured by those parietal cells. And here's how this works. And I'll bet you anything that this equation is going to look familiar to you, because we talked about this equation when we learned about acid-base balance. So just to orient you, here's the blood outside of the stomach. Here's the lumen of a gastric gland. So that would be, if we go back to the previous picture, that would be in here. Okay, and the blood vessel would be something out here. And between the two is my parietal cell, lining that gastric gland. And this parietal cell has the ability to manufacture hydrochloric acid through a multi-step process. Here's how it works. First, this parietal cell grabs a little bit of carbon dioxide from the blood and shuttles it into the cell. That cell has water in it, and the carbon dioxide and the water are combined together, and they are helped along by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. I'll do, you can sometimes shorten this to CAH for short. That's how I'll use it. So this carbonic anhydrase helps to catalyze this reaction of combining carbon dioxide and a water molecule together and creating that carbonic acid. That carbonic acid then readily and spontaneously dissociates. It dissociates into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. The hydrogen ion is half of hydrochloric acid. So that gets shuttled immediately out into the lumen of the gastric gland, and then it enters into the stomach. We shuttle that hydrogen out using an antiport. That means an ATP fueled pump that pushes hydrogen out and pulls potassium into the cell. So it's an exchange between potassium and hydrogen. Meanwhile, I still have over here this bicarbonate ion. Now, I'm missing one component of hydrochloric acid, right? I've gotten the hydrogen part of hydrochloric acid into the lumen of the gastric gland. I still don't have any chloride. So this is where I do a little nifty trick with the carbonate ion. I take that carbonate ion and it gets shuttled back out into the blood. And there it serves as a very nice buffer. Remember, we learned about bicarbonate buffer systems before? So we have a bicarbonate ion out there. It can serve as a buffer. And a chloride ion that had been in the blood gets swapped out for it. Okay, so we move this chloride ion into the cell, and then we move it all the way across the cell and into the stomach lining. So now I have a chloride ion floating around. I've got a hydrogen ion floating around. I have hydrogen chloride or hydrochloric acid. The process where I actually swap out chloride for those bicarbonate ions is called the chloride shift. And it explains why if you eat a big meal you actually get an alkaline change to your blood after you eat. And that's because when your stomach starts manufacturing hydrochloric acid, it starts shuttling out all of these bicarbonate ions into the blood. Those bicarbonate ions eventually build up so much that the blood pH becomes slightly alkaline compared to normal. We call that alkaline tide, very common after meals. So what is it that hydrochloric acid does? Well, for one thing, it drops the pH of the blood all the way down to about 0.8. That's really, really low, very acidic environment. It helps to chop up that pepsinogen, that inactive enzyme, and generate pepsin. So it converts pepsinogen to pepsin. It helps to activate lingual lipase. You'll remember lingual lipase only works in a really acidic environment. Another thing it does is it takes iron that we've consumed in our food that came in a 3+ form and converts it into Fe2+. Fe2+ is a form of an iron atom that we can actually absorb in the small intestines, whereas Fe3+, we cannot absorb that. Another thing hydrochloric acid does is if there are any residual bacteria, it helps to kill those off. And it helps to partially digest down the plant walls of foods such as vegetables or fruits that we eat. Okay, moving along here, I already told you about intrinsic factor and that it's the parietal cells that manufacture it. And I told you about the importance of intrinsic factor for absorbing B12 and preventing pernicious anemia. Pepsin, as I said before, is the active form of pepsinogen. It was converted from pepsinogen into pepsin by the hydrochloric acid. And its job, for now, we're just going to say it digests protein. Very later on, we will learn specifically how it does that. So the net result of the secretion of all of these different chemicals is we get a little bit of protein digestion. When I say protein digestion, I mean chemical digestion of the protein, meaning I broke apart chemical bonds. I get a small amount of lipid digestion, and again, I mean chemical digestion. About 10% of all the lipids you eat get chemically digested in the stomach. We get a little bit of the breakdown of starch, so I get a little bit of starch digestion as well. But notice that no absorption, with the exception of maybe a little water and a little alcohol, that no absorption has really taken place. Mostly what the stomach is about is mechanical digestion, breaking things down into smaller pieces. So again, why doesn't the stomach digest itself when it's got all this noxious, nasty hydrochloric acid in it? As I said before, mucus does a great job of serving as a barrier. It tends to have a relatively high pH. In other words, mucus is naturally alkaline. And so it has a tendency to kind of neutralize any acid it comes into contact with, and therefore it's able to protect the stomach. Even so, you have a pretty rapid rate of replacement of those epithelial cells that line the stomach. And remember, again, that's the responsibility of that regenerative cell I talked about, which is a type of stem cell. That's the one that manufactures new epithelial cells to replace the old. We also have very tight junctions between those cells that line the stomach, and that's to prevent leakage of hydrochloric acid. If you think about it, a really, really painful way to go is if you were shot in the stomach, because if you're shot in the stomach, the hydrochloric acid in your stomach, it gets released into the surrounding tissues and it begins to eat away at your other organs like your lungs and heart. It can be a very, very painful way to go. So I mentioned before there are these cells called enteroendocrine cells that are present in these gastric glands, and that they secrete lots of paracrines and hormones. They also secrete neurotransmitters, but that's another story we're not going to worry about. In all, we know that there are at least about 20 different types of chemicals that are secreted from these enteroendocrine cells, and some of them act locally as paracrines and others travel through the blood as hormones. I'm going to talk about only 3 of them just briefly. Gastrin, as I mentioned before, is it's a molecule that gets secreted, and it acts locally to stimulate gastric glands. So it's principally a paracrine, although it also has a hormone function I'm not going to talk about now. Serotonin is another example of a molecule that is secreted by these enteroendocrine cells. It really helps to stimulate smooth muscle contractions. So it's good for increasing motility in the stomach, that churning motion in the stomach. And gastrin stimulates the secretion of, things like hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, etc. Last one I'm going to talk about briefly is histamine. You've heard of histamine before when we talked about things like inflammation. Histamine can serve a lot of different roles in the body depending on what cell secretes it and where it's secreted. In this case, histamine boosts or it increases hydrochloric acid production. Just 3 examples there for you. One of the things that happens in the stomach is sometimes we can consume something that we really shouldn't have eaten. Maybe you get a mouthful of bacteria from some food that's kind of turned south in the refrigerator, and that can stimulate a response by the stomach called emesis, or vomiting. And it can happen, as I said again, because you've consumed a poisonous food, a toxic food. It can also happen even just from excessive stretch. Stuff your stomach full with too much food, and it will evacuate some of that food by causing you to vomit to release that pressure. The role of coordinating the vomiting process is carried out by a region of the medulla oblongata called the emetic center, meaning the vomit center. And in very, very, very short form, let me just tell you how this works. Remember again that the medulla oblongata is situated down here in the lower part of the brain stem. And what happens in the emetic center does is it sends signals off to the esophageal sphincter, which is also esophageal, or cardiac sphincter, you can call it either, same thing. And it tells that sphincter to open up, to relax. At the same time, it tells the stomach muscles to contract. So that cardiac sphincter relaxes and opens, the stomach muscles contract, and as a result, all of those items that are in the stomach get squeezed up through the esophagus, out the mouth, and that's vomiting. Now, if you have a whole lot of vomiting happen, that can have implications for your blood pH. And I'm going to let you think about the relationship of vomiting to blood pH, and we'll talk more about it in class, and we'll see if you come up with the right explanation for how blood pH can be affected with chronic vomiting. Now, the regulation of stomach behavior is kind of overseen, if you will, by the brain, but there are also intrinsic to the stomach itself, because of that enteric nervous system, there are also controls within the stomach. There are 3 different control centers in total. The brain has something to say about how the stomach operates. That's called the cephalic control center. The stomach itself can control some of its own activities because it's on site and it has the ability to respond to stretching, etc. That's the gastric control center. And then the small intestines also have some say in how the stomach behaves, because the small intestine will signal the stomach when it's time to send more chyme to the small intestine. That's called the intestinal control center. When we look at the cephalic control center, this is the part of the brain that sends signals along the parasympathetic nervous system, specifically along the vagus nerve. And it starts to send signals to the stomach even before you swallow food, getting that stomach prepared to receive that food with the proper types of, hydrochloric acid and other types of enzymes being produced, gastrin being released, etc. This picture down here shows you a nice complex mechanism by which this all interplays, and I'm not going to ask you to know it, but it does give you a nice idea. You can see how the cephalic stimuli starts, then we actually get food into the stomach, and at that point the gastric phase takes over. And this is where just the action of the stomach being stretched because of food entering it induces those the myenteric plexus. That's the layer of neurons between the inner circular outer longitudinal and oblique layers to signal contraction. So those smooth muscle cells begin to contract as a result of the food stretching, and this also stimulates things like the release of digestive enzymes and those hormones such as histamine that I talked about and gastrin. And we get a long period of churning with this gastrin present, the histamine, the pepsin, the hydrochloric acid, and lots of churning around to produce chyme. And eventually, once I've got sufficient chyme produced, I'm ready now to begin dumping that chyme into the small intestine. That's where the intestinal phase comes in. And what happens is the cells in the intestine will briefly stimulate the stomach to allow a little bit of chyme to be added into the upper part of the intestine. And then it will inhibit any further motility until it's had time to digest what it's received. And then it will send another signal to the stomach saying, okay, relax that pyloric sphincter, send a little chyme our way again. Okay, now close off and just hold tight. No more motility for a while. And we just wait until you hear from me again. So this process goes on for anywhere from 3 to 6 hours until we finally get all the contents of the stomach emptied into the small intestine.